what would you assume is the most major threat on the world stage? Anybody, just call it out. You don't have to raise your hand.
Definitely Russia.
Definitely Russia. That's confident. I like it. Who says Russia? Anybody agree with her? Hands? Okay, great. Who else?
China.
Stop yelling at me, but China is a good answer. Anybody? Who else? China?
North Korea?
North Korea. Any North Korea takers? And Venezuela? Anybody? Nope. Oh, yeah. One guy in the back. A little worried about Venezuela. Everybody's cool with Venezuela? No threat? Okay. Let me ask you this. Which one of these places can claim to have the largest oil deposit on the planet? More than Saudi? More than Iran? Wow. Okay. What about things like gold? More than all the mines in Africa combined? The fact is that Venezuela is arguably the single greatest resource of oil and minerals on the planet. So, why is this country in the midst of one of the greatest humanitarian crises in modern history? Let's meet President Nicolas Reyes. After rising to power on a wave of nationalist pride, in a mere 6 years, this guy has crippled the national economy by half. He has raised the poverty rate by almost 400%. Luckily for the rest of us, he's up for re-election. So, who's running against him? This is Gloria Bonalde. Now, Gloria is a history professor turned activist. She's running against him on a social justice platform and on the strength of, in my humble opinion, just not being an asshole. Analyst predictions, as of today, have the chances of Venezuela's total economic collapse at 87%. On the news, they'll call it a crisis. But on the world stage, they'll call it a failed state. If you've never heard that term, other examples of a failed state in recent history are Yemen, Iraq, and Syria. And if that's not bad enough news for you, well, Venezuela is also the only one of these places within 30-minute range from the U.S. of next-gen nuclear missiles. You will not hear about any of this on the news because the biggest players on the world stage do not want you to. To them, unstable governments are nothing more than the greatest of opportunities. So, Russia, China, can never be the most major threat until countries like Venezuela leave the door open to our very own backyard.
If I talk to my number two adversary in the region, Russia, I mean, I've got, of course, the countries, Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua with Russia relationships. But why this region matters, with all of its rich resources and rare earth elements. You've got the lithium triangle, which is needed for technology today. 60% of the world's lithium is in the lithium triangle: Argentina, Bolivia, Chile. You just have the largest oil reserves, light sweet crude, discovered off of Guyana over a year ago. You have Venezuela's resources as well with oil, copper, gold. We have the Amazon, lungs of the world. We have the 31% of the world's fresh water in this region too. I mean, it's just off the charts. We have a lot to do. This region matters. It has a lot to do with national security, and we need to step up our game.
This video shall examine the military intervention in Venezuela, January 2026, within the context of the terminal decline of the petrodollar system. I argue that the US assault on Caracas serves as a defensive enforcement mechanism against de-dollarization. Simultaneously, we shall posit in this video that the global economic crux is shifting from the Atlantic-Pacific axis to a Middle Eastern land-sea hinge facilitated by the Abraham Accords, culminating in an Israeli-led Pax Cabalica via the Ben Gurion Canal, the IMEC corridor, and of course, the East Med pipeline. The recent military escalation in Venezuela, marked by the pre-dawn capture of Nicolas Maduro and the bombing of Caracas, represents a watershed moment in 21st century geopolitics. But of course this shall come about in an incremental manner, and it will be the product of another world war, another global conflict, where these superpowers will knock each other out. And of course, the Pax Cabalica will emerge from the Middle East relatively unscathed. The recent military escalation in Venezuela, marked by the pre-dawn capture of Nicolas Maduro and the bombing of Caracas, represents a watershed moment in 21st century geopolitics. While the official narrative centres on restoring democracy, halting the flow of fentanyl and cocaine, and ending a dictatorship, a deeper analysis suggests a much older and more cynical motive. This intervention is the latest chapter in a long-standing pattern of American foreign policy, the use of the hard way to maintain the global dominance of the US dollar. It's also, of course, the modern echoing of the Monroe Doctrine. So during his political ascent, Donald Trump campaigned on a platform of America First, explicitly decrying the reckless interventionist globalism that characterised the Bush and Obama eras. He labelled the policy of regime change an absolute failure, citing the chaos left behind in Iraq, Libya and Syria. Yet the current reality contradicts that rhetoric and indicates a continuity of agenda. The administration's pivot to a safe, proper and judicious transition in Venezuela is, in essence, the same nation-building business the public was promised would end. The justification for this shift mirrors the lead-up to previous conflicts, just as the threat of weapons of mass destruction was used to justify the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Chemical narcotic weapons and hemispheric terrorism are now being invoked regarding Venezuela. The rhetoric of democracy and freedom, serving as a beacon of hope, is a familiar refrain, one that historically precedes the destabilization of resource-rich nations. So what is the true value of Venezuela? Well, to understand why Venezuela is the focus of such intense military pressure, one must look at the ground beneath its citizens' feet. Venezuela possesses the largest proven oil reserves on Earth, approximately 303 billion barrels, 33 of course. However, that accounts for around about 20% of the global reserve supply. That surpasses, of course, even Saudi Arabia. For decades, the global economy has functioned on the petrodollar system, a 1974 agreement between the US and Saudi Arabia ensuring that all global oil sales be priced in US dollars. This creates an artificial constant demand for the greenback, allowing the United States to print money and maintain a massive trade deficit, while the rest of the world toils to acquire the currency needed to buy energy. Thus, of course, it also allows them to export their inflation, so to say. This permits them the artificial world hegemon mantle, and thus they have the unipolar Anglo-American, or just in this era now, American empire. So that's what it allows, this sort of petrodollarization of the entire world. So on the crime of de-dollarization, and something we've seen ramp up in the last maybe 20 or 30 years, and in fact it actually informs any analyst in viewing, the regime changes in Iraq, Libya, of course the one that's ongoing in Iran right now and has been ongoing for several decades at this point, if not longer. The one, of course, in Syria, the ousting of Bashar al-Assad. Israel also had a hand in that as well. They'll seek to expand their borders, and of course the Yisrael Hashlema, the Greater Israel, into these regions. And of course a weaker neighbours is something that the mad dog of Israel also desires as well, as part of their geostrategic policy. And of course as well what we see in Venezuela at present, right? Venezuela in terms of drugs does not really account for a great deal of the drug trafficking. In fact, Mexico, Colombia, And there's several other ones throughout the Southern Caribbean, and also as well in just Latin America in general, that accounts for a greater share of, firstly, the deaths from drugs, and of course, subsequently, that of the pushing of narcotics in to the continental United States. This pretext of drugs is rather phony. In fact, I believe Trump, in his Mar-a-Lago address on this situation, he mentioned drugs 9 times, and he mentioned oil 27 times. So you tell me what is more important in this situation, right? Now, of course, that's just merely one layer of this narrative web. We'll uncover more as we go through this video. So, the unforgivable sin committed by the Maduro administration, or regime, take your pick, was not its domestic policy, but its active move to ditch the dollar. Since 2018, Venezuela began pricing its oil in Chinese yuan, euros and rubles. Furthermore, its push to join the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, plus a litany of others, of course, those are just the founding members, threatened to create a direct payment channel that bypassed the US-controlled SWIFT system, and of course it would have cemented it with Venezuela becoming involved. The amount of oil reserves that they have at their disposal, well, in reserve at least, even though it's of course a heavier, I believe it's called a heavier crude, which means that of course it has to be processed to a greater degree, which lower profits, of course. However, that said, it has this great abundance of oil that would have effectively, well, destroyed the US petrodollar right there and then if this regime change operation had not gone into effect, a few days ago at the time of recording this video. And furthermore as well, 3 hours before this raid and kidnapping of Maduro, you had the top Chinese diplomat convene with Maduro on this very thing regarding access to, of course, oil, Venezuela's oil, but also Venezuela's lithium and gold deposits and other rare earth mineral deposits. Venezuela is in the lithium triangle. This is crucial in the development of digital technologies going forward and within the AI arms race. So these are the primary reasons for the invasion and for the kidnapping, which, by the way, is absolute. That sets a very dangerous precedent going forward, but these are the reasons for it on that geopolitical level, as far as the narrative goes. Anyway, as we've mentioned, history shows a clear pattern for leaders who challenge this monetary status quo. Saddam Hussein, he attempted to switch to the euro for oil sales. Subsequently, he was invaded. Muammar Gaddafi, and he was executed as well. And he was executed on live television. And it was broadcast everywhere. Because, again, this is mob tactics. You're setting an example to ensure the mitigation of recidivism, right? Meaning you're deterring repeat offenders. You don't want repeat offenders. In fact, Trump addressed this within his press conference. And then we have Muammar Gaddafi. He proposed the gold-backed African dinar to replace the dollar and franc. He was subsequently overthrown. Nicolas Maduro partnered with the de-dollarization axis of BRICS, China, Russia and Iran, subsequently targeted by military force. He'll probably be, murdered in prison, right? Or whatever may happen. Who knows at this point? So the invasion of Venezuela is less a show of strength and more an act of panic by a desperate, decrepit empire. It's, America is basically in an abysmal state, domestically speaking. And most of these empires destroy themselves from the inside out. They're not destroyed vis-a-vis external invasion until they have first weakened themselves to such a state in which, of course, external invasion becomes something these sort of upstarts at the hinterlands of the empire, would find profitable and easy to do. Of course, you have the likes of Western Rome with Odoacer and his invasion. Even prior to that point, you had invasions of the migratory Germanic tribes and other Scythian based tribes like the Alans and Sarmatians. They also invaded because at that point it was easy to do so, and they didn't fear the reprisal anymore because the empire was ailing and it was decrepit. And it didn't even believe in itself anymore, which is fundamentally what you're beginning to see with America. This whole freedom and democracy malarkey, it's not working anymore. People are seeing that the neoliberal world order is in fact a lie. And the mass propaganda is, it's effectively done for. The mainstream is dead. The legacy media is dead. The alternative media is just holding on and sort of holding the empire together in terms of I guess you could call it the pro-establishment, even though they may see themselves as alternative, the pro-establishment neoliberal media. So effectively it's this sort of aging warrior, this aging leader, America that is, who is showing the rest of the world that, look, we still can act in a wild manner. Do not fuck with us, basically. In fact, Trump actually stated this, I believe, in a press conference prior to this event. So this is the narrative that's being spun right now. And this is producing a narrative that will justify, that will act as a pretext for this geopolitical global shift to a multipolar world order, right? All of this is controlled, make no qualms about it, from a very, very high level. What you're seeing is an engine, a hyperstitional engine of history, and it's being established and re-established by scriptwriters who form the ruling class, who form the alchemical apex of the hierarchy, the unseen hand of this hidden empire that is putting all of this into effect to eventually yield, at the end of this all, a world government. This is Ordo ab Chao. That is the fuel of this hyperstitional engine of history. So the petrodollar is currently on life support. Russia is already trading in yuan, Saudi Arabia is considering the same, and China's CIPS, or just KIPS, cross-border interbank payment system, now connects thousands of banks globally without the need for US oversight. If Venezuela, with its 303 billion barrels of oil, were to fully integrate into the BRICS payment system, it would provide the death blow to the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency. The US military is being used not to spread freedom, but to enforce a currency that can no longer compete on its own merits. And as the empire enforces its currency with bombs, the message to the global south is rather clear: fall in line or face intervention. However, this aggressive posture typically signals the end of a monetary era rather than its rejuvenation, of course. You do not abduct leaders to defend a strong currency. You do it to delay the inevitable collapse of a weak one. This is not a show of strength. I want to make it clear to any magatards out there. This sets the precedent that America is desperate, it's decrepit, and essentially it lacks any sort of directionality. Literally kidnapping the leader of a sovereign nation to parade him like Caesar would parade Vercingetorix. Or, you know, the Germanic barbarian leaders would be paraded through, you know, the streets of Rome. But eventually, of course, the barbarians learned the ways of Rome. They learned their military tactics, they learned their administrative techniques, and they destroyed Rome, right? Because Rome eventually lost sight of itself. It wasn't just about its currency, of course. It went through its own currency devaluation. But it lost sight of who it was. It became oikophobic. It had an irrational fear of its very self. Its very country, if you will. It's the very idea that propagated its life. The hyperstition that maintained it. It lost it. So with gold rising 70% and silver 145% in 2025 alone, the market is already pricing in the end of the dollar's hegemony. As we move into 2026, the war for the future of money has moved from the shadows of central banks to the streets of Caracas. The transition to a new global financial order, perhaps involving central bank digital currencies or a return to hard assets. Again, these narratives that we're seeing right now, and this'll end in, you know, China invading Taiwan, some sort of major global crisis being brought forth from that. It'll either be that, of course, the West becomes now embroiled. It loses its unipolar hegemonic status, and it becomes basically embroiled in a now multipolar world order, where these superpowers or super blocks, I think it will be more along those lines, similar of course to Orwell's 1984, interestingly, this sort of perpetual Cold War, and that will maintain all of these super blocks, because ultimately the wars are not fought against external powers, but they're fought to maintain the illusion of the system itself, and to basically keep everyone in a perpetual war mentality, which allows more draconian policies and a greater expansion, a liberal expansion, ironically, no pun intended, of the state's mandate, of the state's power, basically to act as tyrants and dictators and despots. Anyway, that's probably what's going to come about, and then these superblocks will control their spheres of influence, and that's how the world government in its nascent stages will be brought about, and then eventually those superblocks, these supranational identities, Oceania, East Asia, Eurasia, those will be broken down, and then the world government will be brought forth from that. However long that will be, right? Who knows? Only the social engineers really do. Anyway, this is, as I stated with nationalism, nationalism was a stepping stone to these supranational or superblock identities, Oceania, Eurasia, East Asia, so on and so forth. Of course, then to the world government, then to the global citizen identity. So that's what will be brought about from this. And this will either be brought forth through, of course, a world war, which will basically terrify everyone into these supranational blocks, or just straight into a world government, who knows. Or, of course, it will be simply brought about by some sort of global economic collapse, perhaps in the West, most pronouncedly, but perhaps reverberating throughout the entire globe as well. So these narratives act as pretexts to effectively, psychologically prime people for these massive catalyzing shifts in the sort of global geopolitics. So as noted by Borger in 2026 of The Guardian, and The Guardian's a rag, but I found this an interesting quote, and it shows the sort of irony of what we're seeing to be the new geopolitical and geostrategic policy, the foreign policies of these various superblocks that are emerging. So the capture of Nicolas Maduro represents, as he called it, the Putinization of US foreign policy, where legal justifications, counter-narcotics, chemical weapons, or narcotic weapons of mass destruction, mask a raw resource and currency grab, with 20% of the global oil reserves, as previously mentioned, along with it being strategically placed in the lithium triangle and having significant rare earth mineral deposits, including gold. Venezuela's move to sell in yuan and rubles obviously presented an existential threat to US dollar hegemony. So, building on this pattern of currency enforcement and resource control, the shift in Venezuela is not an isolated event. It effectively is going to act as a precursor, one of many precursors, to a larger transition where the mechanisms, of global power migrate from a declining host empire, the United States, towards a new commercial crux centred in the Middle East. And this may take several decades, it may take a century, right? But it will happen. And this transition culminates in what some geopolitical theorists call the Pax Cabalica. In fact, they call it the Pax Judaica, but I think the more precise term is the Pax Cabalica. And so this will basically be a period of stability enforced by the control of the world's most vital trade routes, with Israel emerging as the empire of those routes. In fact, it will be the empire of the route, that's what I call it. Or the empire of the corridor, and we'll go into this. But everything you're seeing the United States do is basically preparing Israel for this sort of, takeover of the Middle East, this for the emergence of their own sphere of influence as an imperial power, a sort of techno-imperial power, a techno-commercial imperial power, really. So that's fundamentally what you're seeing, and it's incrementally coming about, and eventually, just like the British Empire was, basically resigned to the dustbin of history because it had already fulfilled its use, and its sole purpose, its sole use, was to basically engage in World War I and World War II, so that, along with the rest of the European powers, to thus weaken the European powers, and from that the pretext was drawn for the creation of Israel as a nation state. And with the death of the United States, we will go from the nation of Israel to the pretext being provided for the creation of the Pax Cabalica, the empire of the root, the Israeli empire, effectively. So for the last half century, the United States has served as the military guarantor of the global financial system. However, as the petrodollar weakens, the centre of gravity is shifting. Israel, long termed America's aircraft carrier in the Middle East, is transitioning from a strategic outpost, so-called, into an independent imperial power, right? By almost parasitizing this host empire of the United States. In fact, we actually see that one of the first individuals to congratulate Trump on this, little special military operation, should we say, was Nate Rothschild, interestingly enough, right? So this shift is facilitated by the construction of massive infrastructure that renders traditional choke points like the Suez Canal obsolete. So the first one is the Ben Gurion Canal. So this is the centerpiece of this new era. And the Ben Gurion Canal project, which has been, touted since 1963, it's just awaiting basically it's awaiting a justification, a pretext, just like the East Med pipeline was awaiting that too. So it's an ambitious $55 billion plan which seeks to cut a 293-kilometre waterway through the Negev Desert, connecting the Red Sea at the Gulf of Aqaba to the Mediterranean. So unlike the Suez Canal, which is shallow, sandy and prone to blockages, as seen with the Evergreen incident, the Ben Gurion Canal is designed with 2 lanes for simultaneous two-way traffic and the depth to accommodate the world's largest nuclear-powered vessels. By the way, the Evergreen incident was probably instigated by Mossad for this, to ensure that the Suez Canal looked like it was outdated, and thus it sort of generated an incremental soft pretext for this Ben Gurion Canal, right? These things are all adding up to bring these, to bring basically Israel control of these commercial choke points, which would allow them to become effectively the hegemonic power of the world. They would have a disproportionate control over global trade, global resources. And of course that would make them de facto the hegemon of global power. And of course as well, this would permit them the depth to accommodate the world's largest nuclear-powered vessels. And this is why they've recognised Somaliland, because effectively they have to control that choke point at the Red Sea. I forget what the strait's called, but effectively it's the gateway into the Red Sea. They're also investing in ports there because they're going to grow the Israeli Navy. They're going to become a global power. And the US is basically going to die a slow and agonising death within the next global conflict. And of course this is all being set up by Israel and Mossad. Basically everything you're seeing is to bring about Israel as a world hegemon with this empire of the root. By the way, even the immigrants and the immigration that we see into the UK, Europe, all of that is to create what I have called the sort of buffer class, which will serve as the administrative caste for the IMEC corridor, which will begin in India and it will go through, of course, Israel, and it will end in basically the UK. So that's why you have large enclaves of Pakistani and Indian populations specifically in the city centres, because cities are, of course, the commercial hubs which will service this emerging and future IMEC corridor, right? So you have basically Indians at the beginning, or Pakistanis, Indians at the beginning, Bangladeshis too, at the beginning of that IMEC corridor, and you have them at the end. And they will act, of course, in the interests of Israel. And this is why there is a lot of pro-Israeli propaganda in primarily India. Of course, Pakistan still has to be fully neutralised. And that is why we've seen, of course, in Bangladesh, for example, Sheikh Hasina, she was sentenced to death over the student protests, right? It's to send a message to the rest of the political class in Bangladesh: don't mess with us, right? She mentioned that all of these student protests were a sort of colour revolution brought about by primarily Mossad and, of course, the CIA, but they're synonymous. They're synonymous bodies. Intelligence agencies, Mossad and CIA, are joined at the hip. In terms of Pakistan, And then we also see as well, they're trying to push... And then we also see as well in Pakistan, they're trying to push regime change through, of course, everything that's going on with Imran Khan. And there's still protests going on right now. There were protests back in 2023 as well, but that will be regime change too. Pakistan are attempting to resist it, but it's not going to work out for them. We see that following the success of the Abraham Accords in 2020, erstwhile Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan disclosed that the United States and at least one other country had been urging his administration to normalise ties with Israel. He did not reveal the countries' names and did not say whether or not they were from the Muslim world, but explained that the pressure is because of Israel's deep impact in the United States and that, quote, Israel's lobby is the most powerful and that's why America's whole Middle East policy is controlled by Israel, unquote. Khan's administration later reiterated that Pakistan would not establish any official bilateral relationship with Israel until a viable, independent and contiguous country is created for and accepted by the Palestinians. And of course they're seeking to oust Shehbaz Sharif as well, the current Prime Minister of Pakistan, part of the Pakistan People's Party. And in fact, we see all the way back in 1945, Muhammad Ali Jinnah and Allama Muhammad Iqbal put the Palestine issue on top of the agenda and opined that the Balfour Declaration was unjust, which of course it was. Those were two founders of Pakistan. In fact, I believe there were also two ex-prime ministers, or at least ex-politicians, of Pakistan as well. So on October 12th, 1945, Muhammad Ali Jinnah said, quote, every man and woman of the Muslim world will die before Jewry seizes Jerusalem. I hope the Jews will not succeed in their nefarious designs, and I wish Britain and America should keep their hand off, and then I will see how the Jews conquer Jerusalem. The Jews, over 500,000, have already been accommodated in Jerusalem against the wishes of the people. May I know which other country has accommodated them. If domination, and exploitation are carried now, there will be no peace and end of wars. So eventually Pakistan will get regime changed as well. However that may happen, who knows, probably through some student protest or, colour revolution effectively. But these countries have to be taken out, including, of course, Iran, because these are all on the IMEC corridor, the India, Middle East, East Europe economic corridor, which Israel must control for it to become the world, the foremost world imperial power, the premier of the world, so to say. And this is what it's all about. Everything you're seeing, all of the various geopolitical events, all of the unraveling of the world itself through this escalatory escalator, as we're seeing, this is it. This is what it's leading to. They have very nefarious designs for the world, and they want power. Total, unabrogating, unabridged power. And they will stop at nothing until they claim it. And they will utilise every clandestine means at their disposal to thus claim it. I don't think people are fully aware of the type of world that will come into being if these mad dogs get their way. So to continue, by controlling this passage, this Ben Gurion Canal and the Red Sea, they effectively siphon the economic lifeblood of its regional rivals, Egypt. Israel would siphon away 12% of global trade right there and then. Of course, they would multiply that in even greater ways through further economic shoring, through shoring up their control over the global economy vis-a-vis the IMEC corridor, vis-a-vis the East Med pipeline. That's the reason the Nord Stream pipeline was destroyed. Now they have a reason to construct the East Med pipeline. Of course, you didn't. No one, very few people know that. They believe, of course, it's something to do with the US and the US attempting to, ensure that Europe becomes dependent on them. No, the US, I know it's hard to believe, is a very, very small player. In fact, it's a sort of non sequitur in terms of geopolitics going forwards long term. So 12% of global trade currently passes through Egypt, through the Suez Canal. So effectively, Israel would siphon the economic lifeblood of its major regional rivals and would secure a toll booth for the world's commerce. And then we have the IMEC corridor, effectively the Golden Road. Complementing the canal is the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, the IMEC. Announced at the 2023 G20 summit, this Golden Road links Indian ports to Europe via the Arabian Peninsula and Israel. The route, ships from India dock in the UAE, goods travel by rail through Saudi Arabia and Jordan. They arrive at Israel's Haifa port for final shipment to Europe. And the impact of this, of course, would be that this corridor bypasses the volatile Red Sea and the Suez Canal entirely, making Israel the indispensable land-sea hinge of the global supply chain, and it would also allow militaristic control because it's deeper than the Suez Canal for Israel. So they would have a sort of tasselocracy over that entire region. And, of course, as well, they would control all goods going into Europe, all goods being exported from Europe to the east. Moreover, as well, by the East Med pipeline, they would basically become Russia. They would be the gas station for Europe. They would control European energy, and of course, as well, they would partially control a lot of the subcontinent, India, Iran, their energy too, and a smaller part than that of Europe's. So effectively, what you're seeing in Europe with all of the anti-Israel sentiment, well, all they would say is, you better stamp that out, European puppets, European client states. Israel would say this. Or we'll simply just turn off the tap. We'll stop your imports and exports from the East going to Europe. And we'll just basically cut you off economically and destroy you. So you'd be totally in bondage to Israel in terms of energy, in terms of trade, effectively in terms of your entire economy, materially speaking, of course. Financially, we're already indebted. But materially, what you produce, what you consume, your heating, your energy, all of that would now be contingent on the whims of Israel. So this is what's incrementally, in a very graduated manner, an imperceptible manner. Again, I've not really heard many analysts talk about this. Just simply because it's something that's perhaps, 40 years away or so, right? I would say at maximum. But it's picking up pace now. Very much so. So the term Pax Cabalica refers to a new world order where peace is not maintained through the export of ideology, as with the Pax Americana. It won't be a liberal world order, so to say, but through the absolute control of the physical and digital routes of exchange. Basically, you either fall in line or we will starve you to death, effectively. So by hosting the IMEC rail lines, the Ben Gurion Canal, and the high-speed data cables that links east and west, Israel positions itself as the commercial heart of the planet. Moreover, as well, once China invades Taiwan, and of course those chips get the semiconductors, all of the various nanometric chips get cut off from the West by and large, right? Of course, there are some Texas plants that are being set up right now to develop them, but they're being developed in small batches. Hopefully, of course, this picks up, but you're seeing the likes of, within Israel right now, you already have the Kiryat Gat plant, and that's being expanded currently, which is being funded by Intel and also Tower Semiconductor. It's a company, and it's also Tower Semiconductor as well has also proposed major fabs in India, right? So you're seeing major multi-billion-dollar expansions in terms of both the chip production and the R&D facilities to basically ensure advanced manufacturing and supply chain diversification, right? What that basically means is, and by the way, they're setting up a specialized chip plant as well in Ashkelon. So it's all over Israel. What that'll mean is when China invades Taiwan, and of course the West require the chips for their technology, perhaps not quite as much in America if they manage to become self-sufficient with their chip production and expand it, but very much so with Europe. Europe will be completely beholden to Israel to, for example, the Ashkelon plant, the Kiryat Gat plant, and there's various other ones which produce these chips. All of our semiconductors, all of the chips that we require for our technology, we will be beholden to Israel to supply that. Once, of course, Taiwan goes offline. So are you not seeing what's happening here? It's an incremental monopolization of all of the various resources of the world. Not just the resources, of course, as well, the choke points in which those resources pass. So sure, you can hate the pariah state of the Pax Cabalica, the Empire of the Root, but if you don't want to become economically, an economic basket case, become economically obsolete, or to just simply starve to death, you better fall in line, and you better do it quickly, right? So this is the type of this is the system of Pax Cabalica that will define the New World Order going forward, once, of course, the United States and perhaps the other superpowers bow out after the catalyzing war, or, of course, I should say, the global economic collapse that will occur as well. So, effectively, in this scenario, the United States' role is to clear the board for Israel, using its remaining military might to neutralize de-dollarization threats like Venezuela or Iran, thereby paving the way for a successor system, right? America is now being hated. It's a wild dog. We need something else other than the dollar. Thus, as the dollar fades and the world moves towards central bank digital currencies, the power will lie with whoever controls the physical infrastructure for trade and the physical infrastructure for the semiconductors. Are you getting it now? Are you starting to see what is going to happen here, right? The Empire of the Root does not need to be a traditional territorial empire. It is an empire of connectivity. By becoming the sole arbiter of the world's most efficient trade bypasses, Israel moves from a nation seeking security to a power that defines global stability itself. So, on the Abraham Accords, right, this is literally the blueprint for imperial integration. It was signed in 2020 and it's still being expanded upon new nations are being brought in. So if the military strikes in Venezuela represent the hard way of enforcing currency dominance, the Abraham Accords represent the smart way of building the infrastructure that will eventually succeed it It was signed in 2020. The Accords were far more than a peace treaty. Ultimately, they were a multilateral business merger disguised as diplomacy. By normalizing relations with the UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco, Israel effectively repealed the decades-old Arab boycott laws. This allowed, for the first time, direct land trade. European goods can now travel by truck and rail from the Haifa port through Jordan and Saudi Arabia to the Gulf, bypassing the expensive and bottlenecked Suez Canal. So it's basically paving the way. It's preparing the ground for this eventual oligopoly, this monopolization of all trade and the various choke points and, of course, the semiconductors for the CBDC system as well from Israel. And in capital fusion, the sovereign wealth from the Gulf is now fueling Israeli tech and infrastructure, creating a sub-imperial bloc that operates independently of traditional Western constraints. So effectively, it's sort of hyper-accelerating and giving a massive boost to Israeli tech and infrastructure, which will be necessary to control semiconductor production, which will be integral for their control of course, CBDC systems and the global digital panopticon system, through Israel's indirect control of the likes of Palantir and, of course, OpenAI. So you have the likes of Peter Thiel, Alex Karp, Joel Lonsdale, Stephen Cohen, and of course Sam Altman, right? So all of these individuals, I don't have to, obviously discuss their extraction. They're all pro-Israel, zealously so. And of course, this is creating the infrastructure for the global control system, right? You will not oppose them because effectively they will have control of all information, all trade, everything. It will all go through the choke point of Israel, effectively, right? Of Jerusalem. So that will become de facto the world government, because it will control all information, it will control all economic means, it will control all means to even have an economy. I mean, it's staggering. This is the first, basically, it's the first empire that's been built and maintained solely through techne, right? This basically technologies, artifices of sheer ingenuity. I mean, it's absolutely staggering, and yeah, it's a terrifying world, by the way, because I don't know if you've read the Old Testament, that which fuels the project of that is Israel, but and of course even the most popular and populist cult within Israel and around the world with the diaspora, that of Chabad Lubavitcher. But if you read their Tanya, they have a very supremacist viewpoint, one that effectively sees everyone else as mere slaves, animals in human form. And it's extremely dangerous, that's all I'm going to say. And sure, it's not exporting this ideology like what we saw with, of course, Britain in the latter half of its empire. I say its empire, of course. It's the empire of the banks and the financier class who are also behind this final empire of history, we could say. But of course, it was behind the American empire, this sort of exportation of liberal democracy and quote-quote freedom, right? Of course, all basically hot air, complete lies, a facade, a charade for conquest. Rome had a similar sort of exportation of the idea of Romanization and civilization as well, and civilizing the barbarian. So yeah, but now we're going fully towards a sort of in-group supremacist ideology that's contained within the elite and the domestic population, or the imperial stock of the empire itself. And then it has this sort of control of who it sees as basically servants, sort of the servile masses of the broken nations that it controls through, total monopolization of trade, the various choke points, and of course control of the public square and of all information. Complete full spectrum dominance. So the Accords, the Abraham Accords, provided the diplomatic foundation for the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, IMEC, announced in late 2023. This corridor is the Western answer to China's Belt and Road, right? That's how it was sort of touted and advertised. Of course, it only serves Israel's interests. So it positions Israel as the essential bridge, conveniently so, for a massive flow of goods and energy from India to Europe, because the IMEC utilizes a land bridge across the Arabian Peninsula. It effectively renders the Suez Canal and Egypt's control over it geopolitically redundant, and that will be made doubly so with the Ben Gurion Canal. So in this new architecture, Israel is no longer just a state. In fact, it's the global transit hub of all trade, whose stability is guaranteed by the economic interests of India, the EU, and the Gulf monarchies, and by and large, due to, of course, the collapse of Nord Stream, effectively the entire world. And once it gets control of the semiconductor production and the CBDC systems that are going to come into view, with the eventual war between at least China invading Taiwan, but perhaps a Chinese, American / Russian conflict, it will permit them total control of everything. So, as we've mentioned, to complete this empire of the route, the project of the Ben Gurion Canal has moved from a 1960s blueprint to a literal strategic necessity, and they'll have to begin building that very soon. So by cutting a deep water 2-lane canal through the Negev, Israel provides the world with a permanent alternative to the Suez. In fact, a better alternative. The Suez will become redundant, and Egypt will become redundant. It will be easy pickings for, of course, effectively the Greater Israel project, from the Brook of Egypt to the Euphrates River, right? And basically it will permit them total conquest. But I don't think it will be a territorial conquest. They will simply control through vassal states and client states until they can effectively, colonize the world, so to say. So we are witnessing a handoff of imperial power. The US, acting as the host empire, is currently using its military to clear threats, Venezuela, Syria, Libya, that challenge the dying petrodollar system. As that system fades, the wealth and control are migrating to the commercial crux of the world, the land bridge between the East and the West. So another thing as well is they're regime changing all of these countries. Why? Because they're putting in basically globalist regimes which are pro-Pax Cabalica regimes and leaders, right? So, for example, right, we have Machado, who's being touted as the US's favourite candidate to basically be brought in as the Venezuelan president, the new Venezuelan president, right? Yeah, we'll talk about this, right? So the current vice president may step in to call for new elections in Venezuela that will likely result in a transfer of power to a US favoured candidate like Maria Corina Machado, right? And she actually stated in 2019, she stated that, it states here the headline, top Venezuelan opposition figure Machado, Maria Corina Machado, asks Jewish expats to return. So she thanked Netanyahu for recognizing Juan Guaido as interim president and says she hopes many who were forced to leave will now come back to rebuild the nation. And Maria Corina Machado is positioned as the sanitized vessel intended to replace the shattered vessel of the Maduro regime, or administration, whatever your opinion may be. Her explicit alignment with the Pax Cabalica is evident through her formal alliance and public vows to reconfigure Venezuela's geographic, economic and spiritual alignment towards the empire of the root. So Machado's political movement is not merely a domestic opposition, it's actually an integrated node of the global technocratic structure. And she's even stated that she'll open up Venezuela, and this was at an America's conference, I believe, in 2018 or 2019, that she will open up Venezuela to foreign investment, which will be a $1.7 trillion economic opportunity, which of course the Venezuelan people are never going to see that. Basically what that economic deal is she will get kickbacks and bribes as the sort of careerist political prostitute that she is, and of course basically all of the various multinational corporations which are linked of course to this grander empire of the root which shall emerge from Jerusalem. They shall steal and pilfer all of Venezuela's natural resources, exploit them, and effectively bleed them dry, as we see throughout the world wherever this has occurred. I mean, Britain's a prime example. We are now being bled dry. We were being bled dry, of course, during the empire. The people never saw any of the wealth of any of these empires, because these empires were merely host empires of a far more hidden empire that's now about to rear its ugly head from the shadows that it has been lurking within and busily plotting against the entire world, right? It's about to emerge from these shadows. So, of course, we had the Likud protocol in 2020. Machado personally signed a formal alliance between her Venezuelan political party and Israel's Likud party. I believe that's Netanyahu's party, if I am not mistaken. Yes, it is. Likud. It is his party. I was correct. And then she has repeatedly vowed that, if installed in power, her government will move the Venezuelan embassy to Jerusalem. Of course, Maduro was pro-Palestine, anti-Israel, so becoming Israel's strongest ally in Latin America, and Machado has explicitly declared the struggle of Venezuela is the struggle of Israel, framing the removal of Maduro as part of the broader war against the Iranian axis of evil. So Machado's advocacy for foreign intervention aligns with basically a stage of reset, where liberation is achieved through creative destruction. As early as 2018, Machado wrote an open letter to Benjamin Netanyahu, asking him to help liberate Venezuela using the doctrine of responsibility to protect, the same doctrine used to justify the war on Libya. She's also been a vocal advocate for US military expansion in the Caribbean, endorsing extrajudicial strikes on Venezuelan vessels under the banner of saving lives and combating narco-terrorism. So she's a traitor to her own people. She doesn't mind seeing her own people murdered in extrajudicial killings by a foreign imperial regime. Of course, the US, right? So, there you go. She's also called for the sell-off of the state-owned oil company, of course, ensuring that Venezuela's massive oil, gas and mineral reserves, including coltan, are open to the spurious designs of the global clique. And she was awarded the 2025 Nobel Peace Prize, a peace prize my arse. Machado has been officially sanitized, of course, through this by the global oligarchy, providing the moral legitimacy required to oversee the repair, or the tikkun, if you will, of Venezuela's economy through mass privatization. So the permittance, of the pilfering of the wealth of the Venezuelan people. And of course the enslaving of them to foreign multinational interests. So, as we see here, this is all part of the grand scheme of the Pax Cabalica. There's going to be a rug pull very shortly of the old rules-based system. And it's effectively intended to demonstrate that the Grand Architect, operating through the US and basically all host empires throughout history, through what I call this system of human rotational farming, which is about to come to an end, because they're about to emerge as the dominant global force from here on out. I believe they think that will be ad aeternum, so basically into, eternity. They now possess the total freedom, if you will, to reset this world the way that they wish. It's a great reset. It's a great reset. And all of these various morons in both America, Canada, God, even some of the Venezuelans are celebrating because I think they don't realise what's coming, right? It was like the Iraqis were celebrating when Saddam was taken out, and look what has happened to Iraq since, some of the Iraqis even want, they sort of get teary-eyed and nostalgic about those days, right? Because look at it now, it's an absolute failed state, par excellence. It's been, completely milked dry by multinational companies. It's basically a dead state, if you will, economically speaking. And so, all of these individuals, of course in Europe as well, that support this, you really need to get your head checked, and you need to stop having the sort of geopolitical foresight similar to, the render distance of a PS1 game, right? It's absolutely laughable. I mean, you have one here where they're mentioning that Dems are big mad about their dictator Maduro getting kidnapped. Fafo, F around and find out. Other ones stating, we need to take out the Venezuelan military. It's really quite sad. Really quite sad. And yeah, I don't know what to say. It's just a glorification of violence. It's a blind glorification of it, because fundamentally this will lead to the death of the US as you know it. That is what's going to happen to the US once, of course, this Pax Cabalica has of course, similar to what it's about to do to Venezuela and the rest of the various countries and host empires throughout history, is that once it bleeds you dry, it will, chuck you away like the huskified corpse that you will become. I know that because they did the same to the British Empire, which was about as British as the Federal Reserve is federal. Okay? So please, for the love of everything sacred, everything holy, if you support this, and if you are a magatard, pull your head out of your rectum, stop speaking through your ass, and please, for the love of God, develop more than half a functioning neuron, if that, within the vacuum between your ears. And also, finally, please develop the virtue of self-reflection. It would aid you immeasurably in, of course, these years to come, these decades to come. So yes, that's pretty much everything that's went on in Venezuela. I also believe I mentioned Somaliland. Yeah, I did. So that's also the reason for Israel's recognition of Somaliland. These individuals aren't covering their tracks anymore. They don't need to. Basically, the entire world is under their thumb. And yes, there's very little in the way of opposition. Basically, there can be no opposition now, fundamentally, because they have, pretty much most of the bases covered. Economic, military, political, got even social and legal, right? If you speak out against them, you're liable for, of course, imprisonment in certain countries. So, or of course, extrajudicial killings, as we've seen. So, yeah, really, that is their maximum of control. It is FAFO. It is, if you fuck around with the Pax Cabalica, you will find out, right? So, yeah, this is how the illegitimate system will legitimize itself through an atmosphere of pure unbridled fear and, of course, murder, mayhem, and violence, because they're criminals extraordinaire, and they've always been criminals extraordinaire, this financial ruling class. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you for listening to me, and yeah, have a good one.